Hi, my name is Erin, and I've worked the overnight shift at a small out-of-the-way gas station for quite a number of years now. It pays enough for what I need, and I've made it work with my fiancée. Honestly, like most people have said, it's an uneventful job. For the most part, it's just me, the fluorescent hum coming from the ceiling, and the occasional late-night customer. Most people just coming off the later shifts and cops that are on their routine drives. But I do have one story that was weird more than creepy, and I really don't have much of an explanation about it, other than that. It was a pretty quiet night. It was a bit chilly and cloudy out, so a pretty standard autumn night here. I hadn't seen any customers for about an hour, and none had used the restroom at all during my entire shift. Which may sound like a pointless fact, but it is important. Around 3 a.m., as per my cleaning routine, I decided to check and clean the floor and then do a quick check and clean of the restrooms. We have a buzzer system that rings throughout the store so no one can enter without buzzing the bell and waiting for someone inside to open the door. So I didn't have to worry about anyone coming in and ransacking the place, thankfully. The men's restroom went about as one would expect. It was a bit untidy, paper towels on the floor and such, but nothing too out of the ordinary. The women's restroom, however, was a mess. Like a major mess that I won't even describe. Thankfully, I did have time to clean it up, starting at the front, as you do. I got the whole room picked up in record time. And everything was fine until I went in to clean the last stall. There, in the toilet, was what looked like a baby doll. At first I thought it was a real baby and my heart stopped, but as I got closer I realized that it was just a doll. However, this doll was grotesquely mutilated. Its once blonde hair was matted and partially torn and cut off, leaving these ugly bald patches. The plastic skin was marked with what looked like burn marks and deep cuts. But the most disturbing part of it was the face. The eyes had been gouged out, leaving these dark and empty sockets. The mouth, which looked like it was once a cute smile, was cut into damn near a Joker-style grin. It looked like someone had taken their time to systematically deface and destroy this poor toy. I kind of stood there frozen for a few moments trying to process what I was seeing. Who would do something like this? And how did they manage to get it in here without me noticing? I'd been one of 2 people at the store for a few hours, and then the only person for a few more, and none of the customers had come into this restroom the whole time I'd been alone. And my coworker had cleaned the restroom at 11 right before he left. While it could have been placed by him, he's not really a prank kind of person. He's a 60-year-old dude that, while polite, is also very work-oriented while he's here. After a few moments of just thinking about it, I was able to finally get myself to pull it out of the toilet. Wearing gloves, of course. And it looked even worse up close. When I pulled it out, I noticed the stomach had words written on it that were partially gone because they were saturated. But I'm pretty sure it said, "My hopes and dreams." I wrapped the doll in a trash bag, not wanting this thing to just sit in the trash can out in the open, in case this was some kind of cursed toy situation. I've seen enough horror movies to know that it could start with this thing coming to life. I then took the trash out, and the whole time I was playing the night over in my head, trying to figure out who could have put it there, and when they would have had the chance to do so. I even checked the camera footage for the back hallway, since there's usually nothing going on back there, and since there's no way to get into or out of the store, they only record when there's motion. I checked the security footage and clicked through all the recordings for the entire day to see if I could figure it out. And it was the weirdest thing. Not a single person had gone into the women's restroom during my entire shift. And going back further, there hadn't been a single customer to enter that restroom since 8:30 that morning. Doing the math, that was almost 20 hours prior to me finding the doll. There had been employees that had entered to check the restroom and see if it was clean, and to mop it, which we had to do regardless of cleanliness, but not a single customer entered the women's restroom at all. The person that had entered at 8:30 didn't look the type to leave a mutilated doll in the stall. She looked like a pretty normal older lady. So, through all of this, I have no idea how that doll got into the restroom. And I have no idea why the restroom was a disaster, as it had been cleaned and checked a few times since that last person used it. It's also not possible that they didn't just trigger the camera, as the doors are pretty much centered on the screen, and you can't get to the door without walking in front of them. So, by every measure of possibility, this doll just happened to teleport into the stall, and at the same time, it caused the restroom to become an absolute disaster. I have zero in ways of explanation for this, but I will say that it was creepy as hell. Thankfully, nothing like this has happened since, and hopefully it never does, because if it does, I might honestly quit right then and there. One thing that people don't tell you when you go into working at a store, or really any retail job, you learn to read people quickly. I feel like places that are high targets for robbery or theft, like gas stations, make this doubly true. I used to work at a small convenience store gas station when I was in my early 20s, and working those kind of jobs, you see all sorts of characters. But nothing could have prepared me for what turned out to be my last shift. And I don't think anyone will blame me for quitting after this all went down. It was a pretty typical night. Not sure what day of the week it was, but it was a weekday because we were pretty dead. And we would get fairly busy on the weekends. There was only the occasional customer pulling in to get some chips or a drink or fill their tank, but that was about it. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, a guy walked in that was wearing what looked like a security guard uniform. He seemed like any other late-night customer, friendly, a bit tired. We were situated near some hospitals and other facilities that I could see having a need for a security guard, so he really didn't look out of place or anything, and there were zero red flags. I watched as he walked around, browsing the aisles. He grabbed a few things, just the normal snacks and a Red Bull. He was even making casual conversation as he scanned for whatever he wanted, saying that he was working a double shift and that he was trying to get something to keep him going. I laughed, said that I knew all about that, and said that I hoped that it was at least entertaining work. There was literally nothing about him that made me suspicious, concerned, worried, or any other synonym for those words. He walked up, dropped off what he had. I scanned the items and then asked if he wanted a bag for it all. I then leaned down to grab one of the bags out of the box on the floor, and the second I looked up, there was a gun pointed right at my face. He just stared at me with cold eyes and said, "Empty the register." For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't believe that this was happening. The transition from a normal transaction and a normal customer to a gun in my face was jarring, to say the least. I remember sitting there and thinking, this can't be real, this has to be a prank. He was such a nice and conversational person. But the gun in my face was telling me that this was very real, and that this was not a joke. After a few seconds, I came back to reality. I did as he asked. I opened the register and started pulling the cash out of the register, which, being that it was late in the evening, wasn't that much. My mind was racing, as was my heart. and I was so worried about the whole thing going south and how quickly it could. He was so nonchalant, and at one point, the fact that he didn't do anything to hide his face or who he was crossed my mind, which actually scared me more. Like, there was a real possibility that he was not planning on leaving any witnesses to this robbery. Once I got all the bills out of the register, he grabbed it and stuffed it into his pockets. Then, he did something that I will never forget. He looked me straight in the eyes with his cold stare, mimed pulling the trigger, and shouted, "Bang!" I jumped half out of my skin, and I swear I let out a yelp like a hurt puppy. I thought I was dead. I thought he was going to pull the trigger and just blow me away. The feeling in my chest is one that I will never forget, and if I wasn't running on fear at that point, I would have blacked out and collapsed. Then he just turned away and walked to the door, laughing, as if it was the funniest joke ever. He literally walked out of the store like nothing had happened, got in his car, and took off down the road. And I was left standing there trying to process what had just happened. Once I was sure he was gone, I locked the door and called the police, and sent a text to my manager telling them to get there immediately, that we'd been robbed. The officers got there quickly. They took my statement, and I gave them all the info that I could, including the car and the logo on his jacket. When my manager arrived, he was able to get them in the back and got copies of the security tapes for them. The whole time they were there talking and discussing things with me, or him, I just felt vulnerable. And like everything was futile. The dude was brazen about this. Like he knew that he would never be caught. My manager then told me to go ahead and take a couple days off, and I told him that I didn't think I could do the job anymore. I was hit with some major PTSD over this. He asked me to think it over, which I really did. But when I showed up for my next shift, after those few days off, the minute the door chime went off, I nearly started screaming. I couldn't do it, and some people will call me a coward for it, but I told him that I had to quit. Thankfully, my manager was a good friend of mine, and he completely understood. He told me that if I ever wanted the job back, I could have it, and that he wanted me to just be okay with it. The robbery, though, it changed a lot of things, and I lost trust in people. The guy looked and seemed completely normal, professional, even. He was dressed in what looked like a uniform. There was the blue-collar connection that I thought we had. Two people working the night shift and sympathizing with each other's struggles. Then, he pulled a gun on me and threatened my life for a couple $100. I actually had nightmares about the situation for a few months, after all was said and done. About the gun and him yelling bang like that. Thankfully, he was actually caught. But it wasn't in a good way. He tried the same thing in a neighboring town, but the clerk wasn't as cooperative and tried to physically fight him. He ended up shooting and killing the clerk, which made it worse. Knowing that he was willing to pull the trigger like that, it really made me realize how much of a brush with my end that this was. Knowing that he was behind bars did bring some relief, but I was still pretty messed up over that night. I have a bit of a story from back in the late 80s, when I was about 8 or 9 years old at the most. I was definitely at that age where things became core memories, but not old enough to fully comprehend the situation, so it had to be around that time. Unfortunately, the only other person that was involved with this situation, my dad, passed away a few years ago, so I can't ask him the exact date, but I can still tell the story about it. That year, my dad and I were on a long road trip. It was for a fishing trip that he'd wanted to take me on to teach me to camp and fish and all that. A father-son bonding experience kind of thing. We've been driving for a few hours. I was tired, he was a bit tired, and I had no idea where we were. As the night came on, we pulled into a gas station in the middle of a small town in, I think, Colorado. It was a small station with a single flickering light overhead, and it kind of felt deserted. My dad told me that he needed to go to the restroom and asked me if I needed to go. I told him no, and he then told me to stay in the car and that he would be right back. I would say that this was a different time and that this was a common thing back then, but honestly, he shouldn't have left me alone. I will acknowledge that at the same time as saying that he would have never have done it if he thought that it would have put me in danger. A few moments pass, and I'm just sitting there reading a comic book and waiting for him to come back, when the passenger door of the car opened randomly. Startled, I looked up to see a man that I had never seen before sliding into the front passenger seat. He was unkempt, had wiry hair and a completely vacant look in his eyes. I was stuck there watching this man just sit there, completely frozen in confusion. He didn't acknowledge that I was there. He didn't look back or say anything to me. He just sat there and stared eerily out the front windshield. In what felt like an eternity, but was more likely just a couple of moments, my dad came out of the gas station. It took him a second to process the scene too, and when he realized there was some random dude sitting in the car with his young son, he started immediately yelling, "Hey, what the hell are you doing? Get out of my car!" This guy did not react at all. He didn't flinch at my dad's yelling, or even seem to register that we were there with him. He just kept staring ahead, expressionless and distant. My dad saw that I was okay and that I was just as confused as he was, and he opened the passenger door to try to physically get this man out of the car. As my dad did so, the man did finally move, but not to get out. He just turned to look at my dad. He wasn't looking like he was aggressive or angry, he just looked empty. My dad kept trying to get him out of the car, eventually lowering his tone and saying, "Look, man, you gotta get out of the car. You're scaring my kid." The man then turned his gaze to me, and just stared with that same empty look. It looked like he was seriously disconnected from everything in every sense. I will never forget that stare, and how he looked. It was seriously etched into my memory for those moments that we made eye contact. My dad, realizing that the situation was not one that he could resolve by force or being angry, decided to try a different approach. He knelt down and started trying to talk to the man calmly, asking him if he was okay, if he needed an ambulance or needed help. There was no response, but he kept trying, just trying to reason with this man that he was causing a problem. After a few more minutes, the man slowly turned to look back at the windshield, gave a very subtle nod, and then turned to get out of the car. He walked away without a word, and just kept walking down the sidewalk. My dad immediately jumped into the driver's side and locked the doors. He asked if I was okay, if that man had hurt me or anything. I nodded, telling him I was fine, and then asked him what that was. He just told me that he didn't know. And we sat there for a few silent seconds before my dad started the car and we pulled out to get back on the road. We got to a hotel and checked in, and my dad tried his hardest to lighten the situation. I was kind of stuck mentally, just thinking about the man and what the hell had happened that evening. Later on, my dad actually used this to teach me an important lesson. He told me that the man was probably unwell or confused, and that some people have really hard lives, experiences that we could never imagine, and sometimes those experiences leave them lost. It was definitely a lesson in empathy, and I have always held that very close to my heart. It was scary at the time, sure, but there was so much going on that none of us knew about. Now, years later, I often think about that man. I do wonder what his story was. What series of events led him to climbing into a stranger's car on a quiet evening, and I wonder if he ever found his way back from wherever he was lost. I wish we could have done more to help him, but at the time there was nothing we really could have done. I guess my dad could have run back into the station and told them to call 911, but the man was gone by the time we started thinking logically again. Obviously, being the late 80s, we didn't have a cell phone to call them ourselves. And I think that my dad's main concern was just getting away from it, and getting me to safety. I don't fault my dad for it. I'm sure that if he could have done more, then he would have. We did have our trip, and the events were eventually pushed back for the rest of the time out. I don't think my dad ever told my mom about the situation either, and neither have I because, well, she doesn't need to worry. And I wanted to share this story with you because I thought it would be a good one for your audience, if nothing else. Hopefully, they enjoy it. And if not, oh well. Thank you, Raven, and much love. I used to work the late shift at a local gas station. The shift where all you get is regulars and random people passing through. We were just off an exit by a major freeway, so we would typically only get people that were just going into work early in the morning, or people that were driving through town and needed to stop for gas. It was a decent job. Most people were decent, and really there wasn't much to complain about. We had this one customer that would come in a few times a week named Tom. Tom was a nice dude, late 30s or early 40s, seemed kind-hearted and always had something he wanted to talk about. Or he would have a joke that he really wanted to tell. From what I knew about him, he was just a night owl, and he'd been in a few times, and he just kind of latched onto our station as a bit of a safe haven. A place to spend a few minutes away, socialize a bit, and then get on with his night. Over time, Tom and I had developed what most people would call a friendship, though it only ever existed at work for me. He started being a bit more open with some of the hardships in his life, and he'd certainly been through some tough times. It never felt like a sob story, though. He just seemed like he wanted to share who he was, and that was that. I appreciated it. We talked through some things. He gave me advice about my relationship based on his relationship with his ex-wife. That kind of thing. One of the topics that would always seem to knock his cheery demeanor down a notch, though, was his younger brother, Mark. Mark apparently struggled with addiction, as an on-and-off kind of thing. He'd been to rehab, he'd gotten clean, and then he relapsed within the same year. Something that had happened multiple times in the last decade. Despite this, Tom was dedicated to his little brother, and he had put in a lot of time and money to help him out, to the point that Mark was now living with him. From what I gathered, this was actually one of the reasons his marriage fell apart, because Tom was unwilling to let Mark die on the streets, and his wife basically told him it was her or Mark. Tom wasn't willing to give up, and he really believed that things would get better. One evening, I was sweeping up the floor and wiping down some of the station's surfaces, when I heard the bell chime. I looked down at my watch and saw that it was about 3:30 in the morning, which typically meant it was going to be a regular over a traveler. I glance over, and I see Tom's head over the shelf. I shouted out, "Hey Tom, I'll be right up in a moment. Let me just finish wiping this down." He didn't say anything, so I quickly finished wiping down the soda fountain and made my way to the front, but immediately paused when I looked over at Tom. The first thing I noticed was that he looked like he'd been crying, and his eyes were wide in shock. The second thing I noticed was that his hands and shirt were covered in blood. I rushed over to him to ask him if he was okay, what had happened. He lifted his hands to stop me from approaching and shook his head before just saying, "Call the cops. Please, just call the cops." I hesitated for a moment, not really sure what was going on, but after a few seconds of thinking it over, I just told him, "Okay," and walked behind the counter to call 911. When they answered, I told them that I had a customer that was requesting the police, and Tom broke down sobbing uncontrollably. He slumped down to the floor and just kept saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't mean for this to happen." I was in shock, but just kept trying to relay what I was seeing to the dispatcher and told her that I needed an officer there ASAP. It really was not something I would have expected to have to deal with. Tom was such a kind-hearted and gentle man, but the thought of him hurting someone, and to do so in a way that covered him in blood like that, it just seemed impossible. After the dispatcher disconnected, I tried to talk to him to ask him what had happened, trying to keep him calm and connected to the real world. He kept apologizing over and over, saying that he didn't mean to do it, that he didn't mean to get me involved, he just didn't know where else to go. I told him it was okay, that it would get figured out, and that I wasn't mad at him. He just stayed sitting on the floor with his knees curled up, crying his eyes out and apologizing. After a couple of moments, we heard the sirens, and that seemed to push him to a sobering point. He'd stopped crying, wiped his face on his sleeve, and cleared his throat as he watched the officers walk to the door. Obviously, they were as confused as I was, asking what exactly was going on. I guess the look on my face told them that I had no idea, as they turned their attention to Tom, sitting on the floor and covered in blood. And they asked him what had happened, and he stood up saying, "I'm not going to cause you any trouble. I'm not going to fight back. Please just arrest me." And the officer asked him why he needed to be arrested, and I will never forget the dark and painful tone he took on when he responded with, "I murdered my brother." The officer asked him a few more questions, just trying to clarify that he was saying what he thought he was saying, and he confirmed with them again and again that he had murdered his brother. After a bit of back and forth, they did lead him out of the store, and one of the officers came back to ask me some questions. All I could offer were the fragments of his life that I was aware of. That he lived with his brother Mark, that Mark was an addict and was a cause of a lot of stress for Tom. None of it really seemed helpful, other than to confirm that he did have a brother, and that the possibility was there. The rest of the shift after they left was eerily quiet, and I was mentally in a weird place. I found out a few days later that Tom had actually gotten into a very violent altercation with Mark. In a moment of desperation and confusion that was fueled by years of pent-up frustration, Tom had attacked Mark. He left him really, really messed up after attacking him, to the point that Tom thought he was dead. Mark actually did not die from the attack, but had come rather close to death. He was in the hospital and was going to need a lot of work and recovery time, but he was most likely going to live. The news hit me kind of hard. I was forced to think back on all the nights that I'd spent having aimless conversations with Tom, and how much he had wanted his brother to get better. It is terrifying to me to really think about how quickly and how sharply things can go from "I'm doing everything I can to help you get better" to attempted murder. And Tom was not a person that I would ever anticipate getting violent. In the end, I guess we all have our own demons, those voices inside our head that lead to those intrusive thoughts. And unfortunately for Tom, those demons won that night. I guess I just hope that that night was a turning point for both brothers, and that they both got the help they needed. So that, my friends, was a collection of some scary gas station stories. Collection of stories that are terrifying that happen at gas stations. In my opinion, they were definitely terrifying. And definitely some good stories. Interesting ones. The doll in the bathroom one, the first one of the video, is probably one of my favorite stories with gas stations, because it's weird. That's honestly creepy and very weird. I don't know. I don't have an explanation for it. If they watched the camera footage, as they said they did, and they didn't see a single person walking into that restroom except for the employees, then I got nothing. I mean, I guess technically it could have been an employee, but that'd be really weird for an employee to do. Like, there'd be no reason. And I'm assuming that... I don't know. I can't assume. I shouldn't assume. But my point is, it was definitely weird, and it was creepy. All the stories were terrifying, but that one was creepy, so... Hopefully, you all enjoyed this collection of stories. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button to let me know that you liked them. If you didn't like the stories, or didn't like my narration, feel free to hit the thumbs down button. That's entirely on you. Just know it does help the channel. Anyway. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, I need to not be so cheeky, consider subscribing, as it does help tremendously. That kind of thing does help the channel grow. The more subscribers you get, the more the system likes it. Also, fun fact, did you know that YouTube actually prioritizes videos that have higher watch time? So, if you enjoy the stories, please do consider having them on for the entire video. I know it's a weird thing to ask, but there are so many things that affect how videos do. Like, the immediate, the things that affect them immediately are likes and comments. Please do leave me a comment if you feel so bold. But then the thing that helps them long-term is watch time, like how long people stay. It's really weird, and there's no good balance. And if I just ask you guys to watch the whole video, like it, subscribe, comment, all that stuff, I just sound like I'm begging for interactions, and I don't like doing that. So, you know what? Do whatever you want to do. If you want to like the video, like the video. If you want to leave me a comment down below, leave me a comment down below, letting me know how you're doing, or whatever, you know, just stuff like that. No expectations. There's also Patreon and memberships where you can get early access to content like this, as long as it goes up early. I am still behind, because I am still feeling like crap, so there's that. But I'm trying, you know, is what it is. To get better before we can get better. I got nothing. Yeah. Also the super thanks, which is just a tip to the channel. Never expected, always appreciated. Yeah. All that said, friends, I hope you remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you're the best you that you can be. Do not forget it, and please don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And until I see you again, my friends, much love, and sleep well.